Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today we welcome Peter St. Onge. He's a fantastic economist and somebody that we really look for to give us the Austrian school of thought. Pete, great to see you.
It's great to be back, Nick. Thanks.
All right, Peter. Well, I want to focus today's episode on ending the Federal Reserve. This is a concept that is honestly a very American one, all the way back to Andrew Jackson as one of the it's not only the first iteration of this idea, but almost the culmination of the idea in the early years of the country. Jackson campaigned on killing the second bank of the United States. We're now with our third central bank, the Federal Reserve. It's been in it's been an institution in this country since 1913. The income tax, also an institution in this country since 1913. And today we want to think about the future of the country and the potential to end the Fed, but also understanding that we are pragmatists, you and I. We have to live in the world in which we're given. And so what are the realities, potential of ending the central bank? Peter, let's start with Trump's return to power and how that has potentially influenced your recent thinking on ending the Fed, ending the income tax.
Yeah, so I think what really happened over, depending when we start the clock, but I think certainly once Trump came to power, we had two big movements in 2016, which were Brexit and Trump winning the election. And both of those, I think, really shocked the current elite, which is sort of center-left, globalist. It really shocked them. I think for a generation, they had felt like they were winning. Time was on their side. This was the long march through the institutions. They could just sort of take over one by one. They took over education. They took over media. They took over all these institutions. And they felt like they were winning and they could just kick back and enjoy the fruits of victory. And I think what happened with Brexit and Trump is that it scared them. Right. So these were two sort of populist revolts against that elite. Brexit was pretty significant, right? The European Union very much felt like they were on the right side of history, as in they were inevitable and they were going to become this I would argue, a Soviet Union. But anyway, this almost a global government in a sense, right? That just keeps expanding out and out, is run by a technocratic elite, which has long been the fantasy of the left. So those were two shocks. And I think what happened is that the elite, sort of the empire, struck back, right? So you saw a big increase in censorship, in efforts to punish skeptics, where, Mark Andreessen recently talked about the debanking, and that, of course, happened in crypto. It also happened, there have been a number of high-profile people on the right or on the populist side who have been debanked. And I think what that ended up doing was really opening the Overton window wide open, right? So the Overton is sort of the range of accepted beliefs, okay, sort of normal things to talk about. So like 20 years ago, if you're talking about ending the Federal Reserve or ending the income tax, it's fun, but it's so far outside of the discourse. It's so far outside of the Overton window. I think what happened is in the process of that empire striking back, they cracked the Overton wide open. Of course, we had COVID, where in a sense, it was almost a victory dance for the technocratic elite. I mean, it was like a military parade where they could just showcase all of the institutions they had captured. Nobody stood up, like no major institution on earth stood up to that. It was shocking. It was like a victory lap for them. And what's amazing to me, I counseled at the time because there were a lot of people who were sort of standing on the edge of the window, like, it's all over, we're all done, the totalitarians have won. I told them, no, don't worry, because the thing is, they are under the control of their activist wing. They fear their activist wing, right? Like if you could be the top of the globalist elite pyramid. You could be Klaus Schwab. And if you say that men and women are different, you're done. Look at J.K. Rowling, right? She was a member in good standing. She was one of their most powerful tools to propagate. Of course, kids love the books. And she was gone overnight because she broke the orthodoxy. And so I said, don't worry, they're going to commit suicide. They're going to go off the edge because they're going to keep pushing it. The activists are going to keep pushing them over the edge. I think that's exactly what happened. So I think that the election was largely lost because this victorious global elite was unable to say no to its activists. It's one of the most glorious self-immolations, I think, in world history. But anyway, here we are. So they went from total victory to total defeat. Now they're the ones standing on the edge, looking off into the abyss. But I think that one of the most beautiful things about that entire process, as traumatic as it's been for all of us who lived through it, it has left that Overton window wide open. So here we are. If you look at Trump during the campaign, he started out with no tax on tips. That was kind of, the first warning, the first shot over the bow. And then he went on to no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, no tax on first responders, no tax on veterans, which is 18 million people in the U.S. And then finally, he was on Joe Rogan a couple months ago. He said, you know what? We should just get rid of the whole income tax and replace it with tariffs. He noted correctly that the golden age in this country, the golden economic age, was really the late 1800s when we did not have an income tax. In fact, that age ended when they implemented the income tax almost exactly to the year. And so certainly, the Overton has opened up on income tax. That's now in the discourse, which for me is something I thought we would never see in my lifetime, where, people talk about abolishing the FBI. I mean, there are all these things that were complete crazy talk 15 years ago. You can talk about government statistics, whether government statistics are cooked. Are they playing games? Are they putting a finger on the scale? They always have. For example, core inflation was specifically cooked up by Burns to, take the most offensive parts of inflation and try to isolate those. So they've always played games with the books, not necessarily changing the numbers, but massaging definitions. But that was crazy talk, again, until very, very recently. Now, in terms of the Fed, neither Trump nor Vance have been that interested in the Fed. If we look at Trump 1.0, his critique of the Fed was that he wanted rates to be lower because that causes an economic tissue fire, and Trump had promised economic growth, and so he wanted economic growth. So he's not Ron Paul. But at the same time, during the campaign specifically, J.D. Vance started launching pretty fundamental critiques of the Fed. His critique was that the Fed channels capital from the have-nots to the rich, which is correct. And even Trump, I think what controls Trump sort of as a politician is that he has a very distinct notion of who are his people and who are not his people. And if you're his people, he will do everything he can for you. And I think that's very jarring for the left because they're used to politicians who just say things and then do another thing. But he does serve his people. Maybe in a way that offends PhD economists, but he does do everything he can. And so I think that that's interesting because, of course, for Bitcoin, right? So he made a number of promises to Bitcoiners, things like Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, which that I think was outside of the Overton for Bitcoiners. We didn't expect to have that on the radar anytime soon. He made promises to libertarians specifically. One of the things that I've heard from people in his circle is that he was not aware how much anger there was towards the Federal Reserve specifically, right? He had approached it as a guy who, he's a fixture in New York. He's a property developer. He works with banks. He sort of naturally adopts this kind of pro-bank attitude. We need more money. We need easy money. He wasn't really interested in the Fed critique, but through the course of the campaign, he came to realize that a lot of who became his people are really interested in the Fed. And so I think where we are now, I think we have good prospects of at least chiseling away at the income tax. I think we have low odds of necessarily going, root and branch against the Fed. I think we have very low odds of seeing that from Trump. But having said, the article that we're sort of talking about the other day was asking, okay, what if, in other words, sure, it's a low probability, that we abolish the Fed anytime soon. But what if we abolish the Fed? What would it look like legally? What would it look like economically? What would it look like for the dollar? Which I think is most interesting to a lot of people.
Bitcoin is hitting its stride with massive ETF inflows, large geopolitical changes, and the prospect of a United States strategic Bitcoin reserve, 2025 is shaping up to be a defining year for Bitcoin. And here's the real question that you guys need to be asking yourself. Are you prepared? And is your Bitcoin house in order? If you're not sure, you're in luck, because on December 10th, Unchained is hosting a free web event that is an essential session to prepare yourselves for what is ahead. You'll walk away with a clear plan for your end-of-year moves, smart strategies for bringing your family into Bitcoin, and the confidence of knowing that you are set up for the long haul. Join Unchained's General Counsel Jeff Vandrew and Adamant Capital founder Tour de Meester for an unbelievable session to get you guys positioned for the year end, all your tax strategies, retirement strategies, any question that you might have about Bitcoin planning. With the bull run gaining momentum, this is your window to prepare for what's ahead. Register at unchained.com/TBL for this free web event. Excellent. So, and Peter is referencing his excellent Substack, which we have recommended via ours at the Bitcoin Layer. Talk to us about what some of those logistics look like.
Yeah, so the legal logistics are surprisingly easy. You can just repeal the Federal Reserve Act. You're going to have a bunch of sort of leftover functions that you're going to have to redistribute. So you can't just repeal the act. You have to replace it with, but this is kind of legalese. I think if you zoom out, the question is, what are the functions of the Federal Reserve? And fundamentally, so if we kind of zoom back to the history of central banking, the core bargain in a central bank, this comes from the Bank of England, is it's a money printing license, counterfeiting license. And in return, banks or the central bank commits to financing government debt, right? And so this was the original bargain with the Bank of England. It was essentially repeated with every single central bank. And core to that is that inflationary process. So the banks really want to inflate, meaning that they hold interest rates below market, so they have more credit creation than you would in a non-manipulated market. Another function of a central bank that's very important to the bankers is as a sort of standing bailout facility. So they call it the lender of last resort function. Bagehot talks about this. Bagehot is the father of central banking, and he's respected by mainstreamers. He's not a crazy person. But that's a very critical function of central banks. And then you've got this sort of third function, which is kind of nuts and bolts regulatory, just kind of maintaining the payment network. Now, that maintenance function, first of all, there's no reason it has to be done by a central bank. It can be done by a Department of Treasury, by Ministry of Finance. Secondly, the Fed empirically has been pretty bad at it. In fact, the regulatory agencies overall in the US have been very bad at that sort of maintenance function, meaning policing fraud, making sure things work, things don't break down. So if we take, for example, FTX, which was the largest financial fraud in the U.S. since Bernie Madoff, and the SEC is not part of the Fed, but the SEC was policing all these companies like Coinbase and sort of legitimate companies, relatively legitimate, while FTX was happening right under its nose. If we look at Silicon Valley Bank, they literally had a Federal Reserve official on their board of directors, and yet they completely collapsed. The oversight function was an utter failure. It actually begs the question, was part of the reason the oversight's so weak on Silicon Valley Bank specifically because there was a Fed member sitting on the board and, they have coffee together, they go play golf. I'm sure they go easy on each other. So that regulatory function, I think the Fed has, A, it's not very good at it. B, anybody can do that. The bailout function should not be happening, right? That's overwhelmingly unpopular among the public. 75, 80% oppose it. Probably the only people who support it are the people who work at the banks who are going to get bailed out. So that's something that we should get rid of anyway. And then the final question is that permanent inflation, right, which is engineered by manipulating interest rates. And again, that's something that's completely economically destructive. As you know, and as many Bitcoiners know, the quantity of money is not a good thing. Like, there's no reason why you need permanent inflation. You can have plenty of lending. You can have all kinds of economic growth without permanently printing up new tokens. And so, essentially all three of those functions are utterly useless. The one that probably needs lead time is the bailouts. And the reason is because we had a natural experiment in 2008 on that. When Lehman went under, Wall Street assumed that George W. Bush was going to, or they sort of had an understanding that anybody who got into trouble would get bailed out. That had happened with even hedge funds like long-term capital management. So everybody assumed Lehman would get bailed out. When it didn't get bailed out, everybody on Wall Street repriced counterparty risk, and it blew up. And, of course, George W. lost heart. He ended up bailing out Wall Street even bigger than it would have if he hadn't started. But the moral of that story is that you can show up on Wall Street and announce that there's no more bailouts, but you are going to crash them all. In my ideal world, that's fine. Warren Buffett swoops in and buys all the banks for a song and runs them more prudently. But at any rate, that would engender a lot of political opposition.
Yes, we have a banking system that certainly has an ungodly amount of power, so that if we ended the Fed, if we were able to end the Fed, the banks themselves would still find a way to lobby, for the bailout. So there's a lot of history that Peter is referencing, and here at the Bitcoin Layer, we're big fans of it. Walter Bagehot comes up more often than you would think here on the show, and his legacy from the Bank of England, mid-19th century lender of last resort. We also talk about, LTCM, which you mentioned here, which was a hedge fund that got bailed out in the early 2000s due to taking basically too much interest rate risk. And if the bank had defaulted, it would have set off a derivative chain explosion. And that was the reason for the Greenspan bailout itself. It was preventing the derivatives explosion. That is also what happened in 2008 and 2009. This derivatives daisy chain, that can really cause an entire system to collapse. Another thing that comes to mind historically is that before the Fed in 1907, you had JP Morgan himself have to bail out the financial system because there was no central bank. So banks themselves had to come together and find a way out. You almost feel like that's the more free market approach to it. At least we didn't have a central bank at that time. The banks having to come together, pool capital, raise capital, and find their way. But now that we live in this bailout culture, you have this assumption, and then a moral hazard creeps in. So maybe you can respond to the moral hazard that might not go away even if we are able to end the Fed.
Yeah, so moral hazard is when you bail out a gambler, then they're going to go gambling again, right? And that's exactly as you say. In 1907, that was the last financial crash that we had before the Fed. And JP Morgan had to do it on his own checkbook. Now, and then he decided he didn't want to do that again. He would rather the taxpayers handle it, which is understandable from his point of view, but not from ours. But what was interesting about JP Morgan is a couple things. So first of all, there was much less moral hazard there, much less subsidizing irresponsibility, because JP Morgan, he didn't bail out everybody, right? He didn't bail out the completely reckless banks. He did cut off the weakest ones. He bailed out the biggest ones to sustain the system. But beyond that, I think that, you sort of zoom out and ask, well, why were there financial crashes before we had the Federal Reserve, right? And this is the standard argument of people who like the Fed, is they say, well, you guys blame boom bust on the Fed, but look, before we had the Fed, we had even bigger boom busts. Now, there's a question whether they were bigger and smaller. The economic statistics were very different. Generally, they were doing production and whatnot. But granted, there were absolutely financial crashes before the Fed, including 1907, the one that JP Morgan bailed out. And generally, the cause of this was because government interfered in the banking system, even without a central bank. And typically what they would do is that in a completely free market system, so like free banking that we had in the early 1800s, most famously the Suffolk system, SUFFOLK. And in that system, banks would issue dollars based on how much gold they had in the vault. And people were free to come back and, trade their dollars in for gold. And if the bank got stuck, and if it issued too much paper, then it would have to go to some larger bank and basically beg them to, sort of float it through the crisis and get it past this rough patch. So that left an individual bank with two options, right? You could either be extremely responsible and you could issue almost, roughly the amount of dollars that you had in the vault, in which case you're never going to have a bank run because, people can come and get the gold out. You've got the gold. Or the other option is that you do a little bit of fractional reserve banking, but you sort of do it prudently enough that the other banks are going to help you if you run into a patch of trouble. Now, what happened is that the banks over time lobbied the federal government to do what's called suspension of specie redemption. Okay, meaning that under normal bankruptcy structure, right? So you go to a bank, you say, here's my gold. I want what's effectively a gold coupon, $1. I'm going to carry that around. And the contract, when you deposit, says that you can take your gold out anytime you want. Now, what would happen is that every so often you would have some kind of crisis, like a war, and at that point, the federal government would step in and say, you know what, temporarily, banks don't have to give you your gold. Okay, so spot the problem, right? At that point, the bank is functionally bankrupt, okay? It also creates an enormous moral hazard where you had so-called wildcat banks, and they said, well, wait a minute, so I can issue dollars and I can count on the government to, allow me to not redeem those for gold. Well, I'm just going to print a whole lot of dollars. That's exactly what they did. So you had these inflationary wildcat banks, typically out in places like Michigan that were far away from central banks. The reason they did that is so that people couldn't take those dollars and try to redeem them in the more prudent banks. But so the boom busts of the 19th century were not a free market phenomenon, right? If you look at that Suffolk period when it was free banking, you did not have crashes. It was only once the government started getting involved and started essentially, allowing banks to operate in a bankrupt state. That's when you started getting problems. And then, banks still did this, like JP Morgan. They would bail themselves out when they got into trouble. And that finally culminated in the Federal Reserve, where the banks decided, you know what, we're going to be out of this business. We're just going to hand the whole thing over to the taxpayer. And, of course, once you get the FDR, at that point, we sort of have permanent suspension of specie redemption when FDR outlawed gold altogether. And there was still a tiny remnant of it in the fact that foreign governments could still come and they could convert their dollars for gold. And then, of course, Nixon closed that off in 1971. Ever since then, we operate kind of like Ethereum, like we're this sort of marketplace called the United States. We have a bunch of tokens floating around. We have an algorithmic central bank that increases or decreases the amount of tokens in the network according to their price. Which for me is kind of one of the fun things of crypto, is that we've, even in shitcoins, we've sort of reinvented the entire economy, but in super reduced and crystal clear code that I think illustrates it to a lot of people.
What does the future look like if it's not bringing back gold? I mean, in a future system, let's pretend now we can rid the country of the central bank. We still have a national currency, which is the dollar. We have US banks that are issuing dollar loans. They're doing it fractionally reserved, maybe against treasuries. And we have on the outside money, we have gold, we have Bitcoin. It's my thesis, Peter, that the future looks like much like today, in that you have a dollar credit-based system that can expand and contract based off of leverage, based off of risk-taking, based off of the business cycle and liquidity cycle. And then you have these outside assets like gold and Bitcoin that may continue to go up in the dollar denominated terms forever as, the system just continues to be expansive or credit, inflationary from the credit expansion perspective. So what is your response there, and how do you see the future monetary system play out?
Yeah, I think certainly in the near term, I think you're absolutely right that we're going to have a continuation of today, which is that we essentially have a public opinion standard, not a gold standard. So, the public gets angry if inflation is beyond some level, 5% maybe. And the Fed responds to that because there's always the threat that politicians could adjust the terms of the deal and could clip their wings or could reduce their independence and make them more obedient to Congress. So functionally, we do have sort of a standard. It's the public opinion standard. And given that we've just, I think for a lot of people, verified that elections actually do work, that also strengthens the opinion standard. If you look at Jerome Powell's behavior, he has been very interested in reducing inflation. He hasn't been very good at it. Certainly not compared to what he'd originally, it was supposed to be very transitory. It's been years now, but he's definitely taken steps to try and reduce inflation. So the Fed algorithm does what you would expect it to do, which is that it does respond to public opinion. It responds to public anger. Now, if everybody woke up tomorrow, if Americans woke up and felt like 10% inflation was actually fun, then the Fed would let it rip, right? They're not. I don't think they're obeying any sort of prudence rule. They're simply trying to stay a step ahead of voter anger. So I think that it's likely that continues. The only fly in the ointment, that system itself, like having, 2-3% ongoing inflation, empirically, that's very sustainable. Voters seem to accept it. They shouldn't, but they do. I think the bigger risk is whether we run into some sort of debt crisis. There's been a lot of talk of, the bond vigilantes. I think, and you're going to know this better than I, but I think that a lot of people have been surprised that they have not shown up a lot earlier. I think that they're surprised how little risk premium there appears to be, certainly in U.S. Treasuries. But, in terms of a lot of people like sort of imagining the Ragnarok that would bring the whole thing down. And I imagine that debt, in other words, if there's enough debt where investors wake up one morning and decide that the U.S. is not going to pay it, then, you can get soaring bond yields, and then that can bring down the system. It reduces the value of the treasuries and pension funds. It does a whole lot of crazy things that the government is forced to respond to. And note, it's not a question of whether the government can pay. It's a question of whether the government will pay, right? So we saw that in the 2009 European debt crisis, where Greece actually did not have very large debt payments. Okay, as a percent of GDP, they were lower than they are in the U.S. right now. They were lower than they were in the U.S. at the time. Right? The issue in Greece was that they had a political entrepreneur who was a populist who railed against the German bankers, which is always a vote getter in Greece. And he said, we're not going to pay. Okay, so like a lot of the discussions in the U.S., they say, no, it's silly. We're never going to have a debt crisis because the U.S. can pay it. No, it's not can, it's will. And will is a question of you take the right political entrepreneur, demagogue, if you will, you combine that with public anger, and that could happen tomorrow, right? It can happen a lot earlier in a lot of these countries than people imagine. So I think that's the most likely sort of collapse scenario. And then meanwhile, I agree with you, people one by one are pouring their purchasing power into lifeboats like Bitcoin. Bitcoin if they're young, gold if they're old. Of course, the economy progresses funeral by funeral. So asymptotically, that's all going to be in Bitcoin. There's almost nobody under the age of like 40 who's really into gold. So if that Ragnarok occurs, what do we go to next? I think that's a function of when does it occur, right? If it happens next year, we're almost certainly going to go to gold because that's happened thousands of times throughout history. The currency collapses, people latch on to gold. If it's not going to happen for 30 years, so if it does happen in 30 years, then I imagine that we'll just skip the gold stage and go directly to Bitcoin.
Yeah, one of the things that we focus on is the treasury market, and we're observing how, despite everything that's going on, yields are not going up beyond any level that is hitting the risk markets. Basically, you watch the stock market to give you the indication if yields are too high. Yeah. And with stocks at all-time high, it's basically telling you that 5% yields are totally doable for the U.S. economy, which is maybe surprising to some. It was surprising to us, I'll say. Over the last couple of years, we were definitely taken aback at the resilience of the U.S. economy, but looking at how it has processed 4 to 5% yields you basically say that you're not in a bond vigilante zone at all. Peter, one of the things that we really like about your analysis is that you're not shy about calling out the power structure for what it is. You have strong opinions on who the power players are in the world and how it works. And this is something that let's say when the Biden administration is in power for 4 years, you're saying the empire strikes back, they're parading around. Sometimes it's hard to see clearly who's in charge and who's against whom. And now we've gone past that. The United States has elected Trump. They brought back the GOP. It's a rebuke of Elizabeth Warren. It's a rebuke of the Democrats, Biden. So my question to you is, you mentioned Klaus Schwab. Tell people now, let's pretend the viewer doesn't have a great background in power structure in the world. Who's in charge of the Democrats? Who's in charge of Trump? Who's fighting against whom? Who's the World Economic Forum? Who are these people that go to Davos? Klaus Schwab. Talk to us. Just give us a 101. Who's running the world from that side and from this side, from your perspective, without getting into names that we don't know? Who are the names that we know? Who are the power players? Where do they meet? And how do you observe this sphere? Because, we're focused on financial markets, but at a time like this, we have to pause and think about how the world works before we can come back and apply economic analysis.
Yeah, so there's this great model. It's by an economist named Bruce Yandel at Clemson, and it's called of Baptists and Bootleggers. And he talks about specifically how regulations come about, which is that you have what he calls Baptists. So these are people who think that you should not drink on Sunday. And then you've got bootleggers, people who sell illegal alcohol. And they agree you should not be able to buy alcohol in a supermarket on Sunday, right? Because they would like to sell it. And I think that you can look at any kind of government intervention, whether it's regulations, whether it's, net zero, whether it's the Ukraine war. I think you can look at these all and you want to identify who are the Baptists and who are the bootleggers, right? The Baptists are the ones who are out in front of the camera. They are the ones who create the PR. They're the useful idiots, if you will. The bootleggers are the ones who are cashing the checks. They're writing the regulations. This is true in every regulation, by the way. If you go back to the beginning of regulation, it's only about 120 years old, but if you go back to the beginning of regulation, they are universally pushed by activist groups. And then as soon as it sort of reaches this critical mass, the money guys take over. They're the ones who hire the top lawyers to actually write the legislation. Like all of it is done, for and by the big guys. They just use this front. If you look at the 2008 crisis, for example. So in the wake of that, there was a lot of public anger at Wall Street. There are a bunch of regulatory moves made against them. And you can look at one indicator, my favorite indicator. You can look at the number of banks started per year in the US. So it's always been very hard to start a new bank. It's an oligarchy. It's hard to break in. They try to shut you out. Now, if you look before 2008, you had something like 50 banks a year that were started in the US. After 2008, 0. I think you had a grand total of like 2. Okay. They almost completely wiped out the competition. So, right. Wall Street commits grievous sins. The voters are angry and they demand that Congress rein them in with regulations. And the end result is somehow, right, not only do they get baked in place, they got all of their competition functionally outlawed. And by the way, if we look last year when Silicon Valley Bank started and then all these banks were falling, there was a moment when we had more bank collapse than we had had in 2008. But it never got to a crisis. B, they never had to get out there and pressure Congress for bailouts. The bailouts were automatic. It was impressive, right? Janet Yellen got up there and told everybody, don't worry about it. Every last dollar is covered. The FDIC. So in other words, that would have been 100 billion covering 23 trillion. Right? She just made that up. You had the Fed with the BTFP, was it? So, they were just, so they were lending you money against fictitious asset values. So it was just these endless programs where they were just sitting there waiting. Like the banks didn't even have to call them up to, they could just have it hand delivered like Uber Eats, the bailouts. And you compare in 2008 when, they had to fight tooth and nail. So that's what the 2008 crisis got us. Why? Because the Baptists were angry at the banks. The Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street is a bipartisan affair. There was a lot of anger at the banks. Those were the Baptists. Who wrote the rules? The bootleggers. So I think that if we ask, like, who is turning the world into this socialist hellhole and, doing all these sort of attacking the family, the concept of gender, mass importing migrants, all these. So who is doing this? And I think that you want to look for that exact same combination. We'll look at the Baptists and the bootleggers. The Baptists are very important. They're not simply useful idiots because they coordinate, right? And that's really what I think Klaus Schwab does. So Klaus Schwab is not the money guy. What he does is he takes a commission to matchmake. Right. So he brings these sort of Baptists from all over the world together. They coordinate, they share money, and then they fundamentally go off and do the bidding of the money guys. Now, why do I give so much power to the money guys? Partly because they're the ones who get the ball rolling. If you look at green energy, for example, there are trillions and trillions of dollars of very, very high margin investment at stake there. A lot of people have made money off that. Secondly, fundamentally, once you've got power, you are going to convert that to money. You would have to be an absolute idiot to not manage to convert control into money. So either way, I think to a large degree, you can follow the money and you can see who's actually running this. So, if it's hospitals, you've got a huge amount of money that goes to gender transition, very, very profitable. It's very expensive to do a gender transition. If you can convince enough kids, you've got millions of kids times whatever it is, 50,000. They then funnel money to politicians. Planned Parenthood, of course, does this in spades. So you've got these sort of money flows throughout where interested parties see a profit opportunity by channeling money into the political process, and then they get paid back. I've actually got an upcoming video talking about the NGO industrial complex, where somewhere between 500 and 900 billion goes out every year in the form of grants from government at all levels that goes to NGOs. The NGOs are overwhelmingly left-wing here meaning pro-government, right? And that's a natural symbiosis. It'd be shocking if that weren't the relationship. Bismarck started that 150 years ago in Germany. That's kind of the modern progressive deal. But so if we ask, like, who's pulling the strings, I do think it's a number of people. I don't think it's just like one guy or, a small group sitting in a room. But, I think you can sort of like run an X-ray on the political economy and you'll see all these little threads running through where you've got money going out, money and power going out, and then, contributions coming back in. That could be riots on demand. It could be get out the vote. Right? There's all kinds of ways that NGOs, unions, teachers unions, which are, government workers, there's all kinds of ways that they can pay back the support they get and ensure that their allies are in power so that they can keep things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was it was about $800 billion handout to green energy, right? So, that's the payback for all that support.
Peter, what about making Orwell fiction again? You talked about censorship, and where do you see the world heading? Has Elon Musk changed the course of history with the purchase of Twitter and restoring free speech to the social media platforms? What are your thoughts there?
I think he absolutely has. I am really impressed with Elon. People give me crap for this, but the thing is, our opposition party, the Republicans, they did nothing for speech, absolutely nothing. Even when they controlled Congress, they complained about it. And I've talked to members. They were individually very angry about it, but the leadership did not. It wasn't worth their time. They were willing to trade that away for more money for Ukraine. Just complete spineless tools of the power structure that we were just discussing. Elon, I think, he is singularly dedicated. He's got a couple things that are very, very important to him. Getting to Mars, that's genuinely important to him. He puts a lot of time and effort into technologies that would actually get you there. Maybe that strikes most people as crazy, but the point is that he's very dedicated to that, and anything that gets in the way of that is a problem for him. He's had issues with one of his children, sort of got swept up in the gender business. I think that's also given him impetus. But either way, I think that he has absolutely changed history. I think as an inventor, he will go down as the greatest since Thomas Edison. Even Edison had issues. And then in terms of, changing the politics of the country and thereby the world, I think he's been absolutely incredible. A lot of Americans don't realize the degree to which the U.S. influences the rest of the world. If you go to Canada, Argentina, Indonesia, you pick up a newspaper, it's all U.S. politics. It is shocking. I think Americans do not know how influential and dominant they are in the world. If Elon can flip the U.S. back to full protection of speech, that has enormous influence over these other countries. It's kind of a running joke among British that, there are British people, when they get arrested, they demand to hear their rights, or, where's my Miranda warning? And, the cops say, well, this is not actually the United States. We don't have that. But it's such a huge cultural influence on people that whatever rights Americans have, people all over the world start to expect them. So I think that he will be massively influential. And I think that speech, I would put that as higher than anything else I can imagine in terms of policy. Because if you do not have free speech, then you are lambs to the slaughter. You have absolutely no defense. You will not know what's happening to you. It will be endlessly, framed. You look at the propaganda campaign about the vaccine, for example. They will turn you into sheep, and once you're sheep, you will be slaughtered. So I think it's incredibly important, the most important battle at the moment, and I think it's glorious that free speech is winning. And it's also been fascinating to see that when free speech wins, it's not like people redouble their interest in reading the New York Times. All of the incremental speech is anti-regime, outside, heterodox, to a shocking degree, really. And I think that sort of what that tells us is that this elite, as powerful as it appears, if you look back to COVID, it was definitely powerful. It was totalitarian worldwide. You could not go to church. Right? That was something that hadn't been violated since 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. It was totalitarianism. And then you look at what happens when you have free speech. It's like a balloon that pops. It's completely fake. It just withers away. So I think this is certainly the most exciting time in my life in terms of what's coming politically.
All right, Peter, I want to ask you about the income tax. Now, we've talked about ending the Fed, the logistics around there. It's unlikely to happen in this current window, but there is an opportunity to chip away at the income tax, at the concept of the IRS, the waste that goes on in the country, just adhering to the tax code. What are some of the logistical opportunities the country has to fundamentally alter our tax structure, our tax revenues?
Yeah, so what Trump has floated is replacing the income tax with tariffs. What makes that interesting is two things. So first off, the income tax is much more harmful than tariffs. Tariffs are a sales tax. They discriminate against particular goods, those that are made overseas, which is it's more distortionary than a normal sales tax. But sales tax is not nearly as bad as income taxes in terms of how much production they destroy. So there's a study by Christine and I believe David Romer from about 1990. Is actually multiple that have confirmed this, that $1 raised in the income tax destroys about $3 in production. Okay, so it is massive amount that is destroyed, and it's destroyed through reducing incentives. People don't start businesses, because if you lose money, the government's not going to pitch in, right? If you gain money, then you have to pay taxes. That then reduces across the board. So the income tax is very harmful. I think that, in terms of, it's also extremely unpopular, right? Because in order to implement an income tax, you have to essentially have a Orwellian panopticon, like a big brother looking into every single thing you do. What was this money for? Were you paying back a loan? Did he buy you a beer? it's sort of this offensive and I would argue unconstitutional because of the Fourth Amendment. So in other words, they can have an income tax just like they can tax bubblegum wrappers in your car, but you don't have to tell them how much money you made any more than you have to tell them how many wrappers in your car. So I would actually argue that you don't have to you don't have to give them any information. They can have a tax, and I'll just say it's zero. But that's a separate topic. I'm sure the lawyer would be better qualified to discuss. But the moral here is that I think it's very easy to go after the income tax. People hate it. They hate the IRS. They hate the notion that they would basically get a proctology exam every April. They hate doing their taxes. They're a pain in the butt. I just had a video a bit ago about how Americans spend about $500 billion in time, effort, and expense doing their taxes. And, small government people, they often complain how the left can buy votes by giving them money. And here we are trying to shrink government. You say, well, yes, but just shrink the taxes, man. Like shrink the burden. That has, when our country had a libertarian policy, the Democrats in the 19th century, that was the deal, right? The one party said, we're going to leave you alone. So I think it's time for the uniparty to rediscover the joys of promising voters to leave them alone. And what finer way to go than with the income tax? In terms of, getting rid of it mechanically, the problem is that the income tax collects about $2.5 trillion, and tariffs, even optimistically, if you're doing what Trump has threatened 20% on everybody, and then China gets an extra special 60%. And even if you assume the amount of imports don't drop, and you're talking maximum $900 billion. So you got about $1.5 trillion hole. Now, as a libertarian, I would say, sounds great. Just, stop invading other countries, quit with the illegals, and, you can cut a couple of big things and you'd be good to go. Stop giving people welfare who are able-bodied. But that would, of course, be a massive fight. That would also involve both parties, right? The sort of deal that they have running in Washington is that the Democrats get an extra $1 million for quote-unquote social policies, which are largely slush funds for their activists. And then Republicans get $1 million for wars, which is a slush fund for their donors, military-industrial complex. And there's this sort of obscene symmetry to it where both parties get to spend. And so if you're rolling in and you're saying, okay, but here's what's funny. So we need to cut $1.5 trillion. Maybe each of you can give up $750 billion. So that's not going to be real popular with the activists and the donors. And so you're absolutely going to have them fighting back. Now, if we sort of zoom out, like for a lot of these things, right, whether it is a government that's taking too much in taxes, shrinking the government, shrinking the economy too much, whether it's a debt crisis, historically, the way that these things tend to resolve is that you run into some sort of crisis. The frog boils, jumps, and then it gets fixed, right? You bring back in gold or the government radically shrinks. If we look at Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, right, that was definitely a frog jumping. And, you have like flat taxes in most of Eastern Europe. They're quite low. I think like Bulgaria has 8 or 10% flat tax. So that's traditionally the way you get it, is that the water boils and then you have, some sort of upstanding reformers who can hopefully install something better. My goal, I think yours as well, is to try to get there without the frog boiling, try to get there ahead of time. And there, I think a big piece of that is really going back to the free speech. So the uniparty is going to fight it. The rhinos, the sort of left-wing Republicans are going to fight it. The Democrats, of course, don't want to shrink the government. They're the party of government. And so the only way that you can get past that is direct appeal to public opinion, right? You have to go to the voters. You have to get them upset. You have to credibly fund primaries, which Elon, by the way, has promised to foot the bill for primaries for anybody who blocks his agenda. We can't keep relying on Elon, though. Like at some point, we have to take care of ourselves. But free speech, I think, just fundamentally has to be the mechanism. The system will not fix itself. It is the way it is for a reason, right? It benefits everybody involved, everybody who's got the power. And so if you want to break that, you've got to bring somebody in who is outside the power structure. That includes Elon. It includes Trump. But most of Congress can ignore Elon and Trump. What they can't ignore is losing an election. So that's fundamentally why I think the battle is on free speech.
Peter St. Onge on free speech, ending the Fed, ending the IRS, maybe replacing the income tax, Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, Davos, and much, much more. Peter St. Onge, thank you so much for joining us today at the Bitcoin Layer. We really enjoyed. Please tell people where they can find your fantastic work.
Most of what I do is on Twitter. I put out daily videos on the economy and freedom. So that's at PROFSTONGE. So I have a Substack, and the stuff goes out on YouTube.
We'll catch you guys next time.